Maybe you've heard that California has been having some water trouble lately. And by lately, I mean for the past 5 years. California is experiencing a serious drought, and if it continues, it could cause permanent damage to its ecosystems, threaten its precious freshwater resources, and ruin the state's many, many crops. But maybe you're thinking, how can a state that shares 1,350 kilometers of coastline with an ocean be out of water? Well, ocean water is full of salt, that's how. But it doesn't have to stay that way, because there's a process called desalination, which removes the salt from the seawater to make it drinkable. It's already used in some parts of the world on a large scale, so now both scientists and citizens are wondering whether desal, as it's sometimes called, can help California out of its drought. So let's take a look at how desalination currently works. There are 5 different methods used in facilities around the world to extract pure water from seawater. But over 80% of the world's desalinated water is produced by just 2 of these methods. They are known as reverse osmosis and multistage flash. Reverse osmosis uses pressure to remove salt, other minerals, and microbes from seawater. The water is pumped through a bunch of semi-permeable membranes, which contain tiny pores that let water molecules pass through, but filter out other particles if they're too big or charged. The water that gets forced through the membranes becomes usable freshwater. But the leftover water is just so salty and full of other junk that it's too expensive to extract any more freshwater, so it's sent off to a separate treatment plant. This extremely salt-saturated water is known as concentrate, or brine. In a multistage flash, seawater is brought to a boil multiple times as it travels through a series of chambers, creating some water vapor and leaving the dissolved salts in a liquid. Fresh water is collected as the water vapor rises to the top of these chambers and condenses. Then the leftover brine is either recycled in other parts of the system or disposed of somehow. These technologies have been effectively used in thirsty countries around the world. For example, the Ras Al Khair desalination plant in Saudi Arabia uses both reverse osmosis and multistage flash processes. It's capable of pumping out about 1 million cubic meters of desalinated water every day. In Israel, meanwhile, Sarik desalination plant uses reverse osmosis exclusively and can supply around 620,000 cubic meters of fresh water per day to the country's water system. So why don't we use this stuff to solve California's drought problems? Well, even the biggest desal plants in the world are only supplemental. They don't make enough water to support an entire population. The Carlsbad desalination plant in California, for instance, is helping produce fresh water through reverse osmosis, but at best, it provides less than 10% of regional water demand. Desalinating seawater can also be twice as expensive as treating other water sources like rainwater or wastewater. On a large scale, most of that expense comes from the energy that's needed to heat the water or apply pressure to it. According to some estimates, it takes about $25,000 worth of electricity per month to produce enough desal water for only 1,200 homes. Plus, there's the problem of how to process all that leftover brine. You can't just dump it back into the ocean because the extreme levels of salt have been shown to damage fish, coral, and seagrass. Finally, there are logistics to consider. Most of California's water is used for agriculture, but the state's growers would be largely unaffected by any effort to desalinate seawater. Why? Because most California farms are inland, not even close to the ocean, which is generally where you'd want to put a desalination plant. So, to help quench California's thirst, we're gonna have to try new desal technologies. One promising technique scientists are developing in California is solar desalination, which harnesses the thermal energy of the sun to power a desalination plant. An example of this would be a multiple effect distillation plant, which is a lot like multistage flash, except the steam from the first stage is used to boil water in the second stage, and the steam from the second stage is used to boil water in the third stage, and so on. Solar desal may be able to make clean water at lower cost than conventional desal, and it could produce less brine. Some companies even estimate around 93% of the salt water being turned into fresh water. For now, though, the cost and logistical problems of desalinating seawater are just too big to solve problems like the California drought. But with more research and ingenuity, desal plants could provide at least some relief to drought-stricken communities everywhere. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, brought to you by our patrons on Patreon. If you want to help support the show, just go to patreon.com/SciShow. And don't forget to go to youtube.com/SciShow and subscribe. A study from NASA suggested that Western North America could enter a megadrought within the next few decades, propelled in part by climate change. But what are megadroughts?